As our next panel makes its way to the stage, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator, and I'll let him introduce the remaining people on the panel. Len Waverman is a world-renowned expert in international telecommunications, and on the side happens to be the Dean of the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. He's been a professor of economics at University of Toronto, the London Business School, and Dean of the Haskayne School of Business at University of Calgary. He's also a longtime friend and colleague of mine, which I hope you won't hold against him. We appreciate him moderating this morning's panel, looking at innovating for success at the cusp of the digital revolution. I'll invite Len and his panel here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. You know, it's great to be your friend, I must say. So as Mark has said, my name is Len Waverman. I'm honored to be the Dean of the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University, which has an enormous increase in students. When I was growing up in downtown Toronto, the thought of going to McMaster as an undergrad struck me with fear. But if you haven't been to Hamilton recently, it's an amazingly vibrant, restaurant-filled music capital. Great place for your children to go and get a degree, especially in business. So let me introduce the panel in the order of which they're speaking. Dan Schwanen is the VP Research at C.D. Howe Institute. Jack Mintz at the end, founder of the School of Public Policy at Calgary, among many other things, and on tax policy, one of the great people in the world. Christine Calvoza is the Deputy CIO for Technology and Resiliency at the Federal Communications Commission. I'm going to moderate and say a few words after Christine. Now, the title of the panel that Mark gave us is Innovating for Success at the Cusp of the Digital Revolution. So being an academic, I, of course, looked up what is the meaning of the word cusp. Online, of course. Raise your hands if, like me, you have physically lifted an encyclopedia in your life. Thank you. There are 3 people. There are 8 definitions of cusp. I won't read them all to you. One of them is in architecture. It's a molded projection at the point of a small arch in Gothic tracery. But I think what Mark meant, it's a point of transition between 2 different states. So I thought about what are the different states that Mark and Michael were thinking of. And we're just between 2 famous anniversaries. I thought the speaker before me was going to steal my lines, but he didn't. So June 29th of 2017 is the 10th anniversary of the beginning of a cusp. What was special that day? Like, I'm an MBA teacher, so I always ask questions. The iPhone hit the market June 29th, 2007. That was a vast 10 years ago. And when did 4G LTE hit the market? 4th of June 2010, 7 years ago, Sprint released the first smartphone in the US, the HTC Evo 4G. So the cusp we're in, so cusp really in telecoms or innovation, or in any epoch like the steam engine, is not a point, but it's really a spread out set of years where all these things are happening. So it could be a pretty long cusp. And now it's all about innovation. Now, innovation is a particularly touchy subject in Canada. In patents per capita or percentage of GDP per capita, when our Minister of Innovation goes to the OECD, it's thankful that Italy is in the room because we look pretty sad compared to other countries. But if you add design expenditures, Italy moves way up the table. So what is innovation? How do we measure it? And who's responsible for it? But what our panel is going to be looking at mainly is what's the role of policy and what policy. So let me begin with Dan.
Oh, from here or from there?
Yeah, you go over there. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Len, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'll start with a short talk on Canada's innovation policy and where it's going. So as Len mentioned, Canada is known for, in the world of innovation policy, being stuck in what Peter Nicholson, former chair of the Canadian Council of Canadian Academies, has called a low innovation equilibrium. And we know this, or we think we know this, from a number of metrics that are collected by various agencies, including the OECD and think tanks. In these rankings of innovation, again, using different metrics, some of which are more questionable than others, some of which don't include design, which is a very important part of innovation. But nevertheless, in or along those metrics, we usually rank from not very highly to poorly compared to comparator countries. That is to say, other high-income countries or countries that are moving up rapidly the income tables. Now, the source of the problem has been debated, researched. There have been advisory panels galore over the decades because this is an ongoing problem. The source of the problem, however, we now think finally that we have it. Others have mentioned it before, but the advisory panel chaired by Tom Jenkins, for example, mentioned it. The recent Advisory Council on Economic Growth that reported to the federal government earlier this year mentioned it, and the federal budget 2017 clearly states it. And the problem is one of commercialization. So we have a lot of great ideas coming from Canada, a lot of great researchers, a lot of great talent in academia and elsewhere, but the ideas that they produce tend to be commercialized by others. This is an average, of course. Everybody knows that we have some great companies that have taken great Canadian ideas and brought them to the market very successfully, some initially successfully and then not so successfully, which is another issue. But in general, of course, that doesn't mean we don't have great companies. It just means somehow we have fewer than some of our peers. Now, we have great companies in the resource sector, for example, but what we're talking about here is the raw material of the future growth of the economy is, of course, ideas, knowledge, and the question here, again, perhaps to repeat, is our companies or companies operating in Canada are not very good at developing an economy in Canada, if you like, and successful businesses and export-oriented businesses based on the ideas that we have developed here in Canada. And one of my favorite indicators that illustrates this, if I did have a chart, I would show a chart based on our balance of payment data, since I'm a trade economist, so trade with the rest of the world. And what you would see is that Canada registers a growing and now a very large surplus in research and development services. That is to say, we have a lot of Canadian researchers, good Canadian researchers here, people that work on software and other patentable or copyrightable material, but they work for others. So there's a lot of foreign companies that are here in Canada. They essentially employ researchers in Canada, but they end up owning the IP. And the counterparty of that, but they do employ a lot of people here, so we have a large surplus in these kinds of services, people working here in research and development. But the ideas belong, more often than not, somewhere else, or the patents or the copyright belong more often than not to someone outside of Canada that can develop the product, develop the idea. And so we have a large deficit on the royalties front, on the license front. So think about that. Basically, the ideas are being mined here, and the IP is often owned, more often than not, owned elsewhere because somebody else has had a great idea about how to develop that into let's say, Canadian ideas or lots into a commercial product. So what's been the government's response? The response has been, if I can caricature it a little bit, as less what we've done in the past, which is subsidizing the inputs into the innovation process. So relatively less subsidizing of research and development through generous tax credits, the most generous in the world, in fact. So people are scratching their head and say, how come we don't get innovation? We subsidize R&D. We subsidize university research. And all of these things are very good. But in the last budget, I think it's fair to say that the government has made a shift towards what they call, the federal government, and becoming a nation of innovators. And by that, they mean using the ideas developed in Canada or made in Canada to develop commercially viable activities more than we have so far in Canada, so that we can benefit from all this research and development, all this talent. So one of the things they've done is accelerated the skills agenda so that when we, well, first of all, we produce the skills, STEM skills and others here in Canada that are needed for this new innovation economy. They're reinvesting in that, and also making immigration or work visas more accessible for companies that need foreign talent. If they want to develop their business here in Canada, make the foreign talent more accessible when it's needed, when the Canadian talent is not available. But the new neat idea is that of, well, sorry, I shouldn't necessarily call it neat. The new intriguing idea is that of these innovation superclusters, where the government has basically identified 6 sectors where Canadians have some solid knowledge, some solid, have done some solid research made in Canada, and the digital technology sector is one of those sectors. And what they want is the knowledge, to connect the knowledge in that sector here in Canada with companies and venture capital funds that can develop it here in Canada. They're making almost $1 billion over 5 years available for these kinds of initiatives. Again, from the point of view of the government, is going to please risk it, risk your capital, invest in Canada, use the Canadian talent, and there's some risk involved in that. We're going to share the risk. That's part of the strategy. I think it's better than simply relying on what I would call formally a spray and pray strategy of just, oh, you're doing R&D, absolutely, we're going to subsidize this, and then not necessarily asking where that's going for, or that's how that is going to help Canadian economic development. So I think the idea is good, a more focused innovation policy, focused by sector, and focused on commercialization rather than simply building the knowledge, focus on commercializing the knowledge. That's a good thing, but in my view, it's not enough. And let me quickly tell you why, what's missing. Number one, what's missing is the government, with respect, of course, are absolutely great at telling people that there's not enough R&D in the private sector, and the private sector is not doing enough. I would say that there's probably also not enough innovation in government. And you can think, for example, of or in the public sector a bit large. You can think, for example, of our healthcare sector, where we spend more money than some comparator countries, but we get actually worse outcomes. Obviously, I'm not comparing ourselves to the United States, but to countries in Europe, Australia, and so on. And so if we spend more money and we have worse outcomes, can we learn from how others organize their activities in that sector, as well as in others that are mainly, obviously, part of our public sector? Can we inject more innovation in that sector? Can we inject more commercialization and private enterprise in that sector, as well as other countries have done? Why that's important, not just to bring innovation in that sector per se, which is about 10% of our economy, but also because that way you can have a better balance between the taxes that we pay, that our companies and talent pay, and the services that they receive. And that's also very important. We have the world-leading expert here on taxation, so I'm not going to go further on that. But really, taxation is also another important, perhaps missing part of our innovation strategy. So one is innovation in the public sector. Second is taxation, which innovation in the public sector can make more reasonable relative to the services, the public services that we have, and that should attract talent, should attract businesses. And the third and final thing is our regulatory environment, our laws, as they apply to some of these innovative sectors that we've identified. You know, we're talking in the communications sector, we have a review of the Copyright Act coming in the fall. We have an ongoing review of cultural policy. We have foreign direct investment restrictions. And I would argue that a major lens through which the government should look at the outcome of these reviews is the innovation lens. We need to navigate the fine line, for example, between the protection of rights and making content readily available to the public. Both these things are important to sustaining innovation, but sometimes often they're at odds with each other. And so it's the real question is, where do you draw that line to make sure that the line is on the side of promoting innovation rather than stifling it? Similarly, with ensuring that the returns are there for companies that invest in networks, but also that their services are affordable, bridging the digital divide, and so on. Both these things are actually important for innovation, but it's really where you draw the line. And so my plea is, I think, my conclusion is I think the government is on the right track with respect to a renewed innovation policy. I think we're going to see some exciting things. But since at the Institute we're not in the habit of always just praising the government for things, I'm also going to say that a major part of our innovation strategy has to include a look at our public sector institutions, a look at our taxation, and a look at our laws, regulations, especially as they apply to some of the sectors that I mentioned, including, of course, the digital economy. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Len, and it's good to follow, a good discussion about some of the broad issues in innovation. Let me start with, obviously, the statement that everybody in this room will agree with, and that is innovation is key to growth. But when I think about innovation, I think of it in a very broad context. It's not just the creation of ideas, but it's also the adaptation of ideas. And the telecommunications or the communications industry in general is an example of one such sector, as well as high tech, which is critical, I think, to part of the innovation process that we need in Canada. And it's critical not only in terms of creating ideas and developing ideas, but also in terms of adoption of ideas within the general business community. So I'm going to pose an important question today, and that is, why do we tax the heck out of the sector? Which is, I'm going to explain to you in a few moments, is actually one of the most highly taxed sectors in the economy today when it comes to capital investments. Now currently, the tax on new investments that we calculate all the time is roughly 24.2%. This is the third highest amongst all the sectors in Canada. It is about a point less than construction and what is defined as other household and business services, which would include things like engineering, architecture firms, and et cetera. We still have a tax system that particularly levies relatively low taxes on manufacturing, mining, and forestry. Believe it or not, oil and gas actually is in the high tax sector. It's even more heavily taxed than communications. So this, I think, raises, a very important question. And that is, if we really believe in innovation and in the adoption of innovation, why is it that we end up putting one of the highest effective tax rates on new investments in a sector which is so critical to the innovation process? So that's the query, or the question that I want to raise. Now, on top of all this, we are now hearing proposals like the one made by Bill Gates about having a robot tax. In other words, a tax that would be essentially on labor-saving innovations that result in workers being displaced, and that money would then go to the government, presumably, to help those workers with the problems of displacement, as well as broaden the social safety net. All sounds really good. Of course, I'm not quite sure why Bill Gates, who has his own Microsoft computers that led to substantial labor substitution with respect to back office work and secretaries, et cetera, why one wouldn't want to tax his computers as well. In fact, anything that's labor savings, one might say, let's tax it as a result. Now, I'm not arguing for it, but I always think of going back to Thomas More's Utopia, where everybody is satiated except with leisure, and in fact would not have to work anymore. And if we could tax all the machinery around us that are doing work for us, we can enjoy a very leisurable life and just use the tax revenues that are raised on it so that people can be fed and everything else that they need. If we did have something like a robot tax as a way of let's say funding the future needs of the population. Now, I don't think that's going to be possible because we now know that innovation often is more complex and often leads even for more work and not necessarily less work. Now, we are going through very rapid innovation, as every speaker, I'm sure, talks about, whether it's artificial intelligence, precision medicine, nanotechnology, but it's unlikely that work will ever disappear. Someone still has to manage resources, and resources are constrained, and one has economic valuation associated with those resources. Machines can substitute for work, but as a result of increased output, there's increased demand for workers as well with that increased output. So innovation doesn't necessarily lead to less workers being hired. In fact, you can have more workers being hired if you end up getting what are called these output effects, where there's more output and income in society, demanding more work from people, whether it's working in different stores, restaurants in the economy, or providing the basic services that are needed for people to manage their work that robots can't do. And this has been the experience of innovation over several centuries, whether we go back to the steam engine of 200 years ago that led to capitalism and the growth of Britain at that time, and displacement of rural workers into the urban community, or whether we're talking about innovations like transportation that occurred in the 1950s that led to major changes in the way that we do things as well. So I think that the issue for Canada, and this is where I agree very much with the view, is that our problem is not so much in the creation of ideas, we're getting a lot of it. The problem is in adaptation of those ideas in the commercial process. In fact, some of the work that I've done over the years, we've noted that Australia actually is kind of low in research and development intensity as well as Canada. That's because a lot of money goes into exploration and development in the resource sector, which in my view is a form of discovery, but it doesn't get included in research and development. But what Australia did much better than Canada, especially in the 1990s, was adaptation of innovation in the business sector. So this goes back to my main point. Why do we tax the communication sector so heavily in Canada if we want to have more innovation? In fact, I think we need to use our tax policy to make it more attractive for people to demand innovation in Canada and not just create innovation. And this was a theme of a business tax reform that I chaired for Paul Martin 20 years ago, that we have a tax system that's skewed towards certain sectors, the primary and the manufacturing sectors, but then we end up taxing those people that could use the innovations, and we had a relatively high level of taxation on that. Now, how best actually to achieve this? I'm on the area of taxation. I should point out that research and development is supported not just by taxes, but also grants from governments. And although people talk about the tax support in Canada being more generous than many other countries, we're not as generous on the grant side. And in fact, in the work that I used to do, comparing Canada and the United States, actually US support for research and development, whether done through the grant system or through the tax system, is just as much as in Canada. But the big difference is that the US, it's much more focused on certain sectors, given the demands by the public sector for specific needs, particularly military needs. And if you look at the history of technology over the past 2,000 years, as discussed in a book by Ian Morris of Stanford University a few years ago, actually a lot of technology is driven by military needs in the public sector. In fact, even things like the portable computer was actually driven by the needs of the US Army to have a computer that could move, and they subsidized Silicon Valley to find a way of having portable computers, which is to say that you can get the public sector sometimes, because of their own needs, identifying those needs, and that actually is often what drives innovation, is to try to solve a problem. This is why actually one area I don't agree with Daniel is I don't think governments picking winners and losers is a very good idea. In fact, I'm not certain the supercluster idea is the smart idea. I like seeing superclusters really be driven by the private sector, where I think the best things could be done. And I think if you create the right macroeconomic environment, that's a much better way of achieving, I think, R&D, innovation, and adoption of innovation in the process, as opposed to governments picking what they think is the best sectors in order to drive the economy. And so I would suggest that we should look at those macroeconomic variables, one of them being the tax system, for example, the inadequate treatment of depreciation relative to economic depreciation in the telecommunications sector. I think that we should also be looking also at regulations. Where we have over-regulation, we should be trying to reduce those regulations to spur more competition. And of course, some of those things Daniel mentioned, such as foreign ownership rules, but I'm sure there's some other things that one can also talk about on the regulatory side that could spur more competition in the sector, but also encourage our other businesses that end up being protected in Canada from competition, so that they have a greater demand for innovation and wish to adopt innovation as well. So now we have major rumblings from the South, which I call policy disruption from the United States. And we'll have to see where the Americans go with respect to deregulation and tax reform. But we have done some analysis to look at what would happen if something like the House blueprint was adopted in the United States, or something like the Trump plan that's being discussed, whether there's in other words, a major reduction in corporate taxes. Canada actually only has a small business tax advantage when it comes to telecommunications in terms of its effective tax rate and new investments compared to the United States at the current time. But if you actually look at what would happen under US tax reform, the effective tax rate on new investments in communications is going to drop below the Canadian rate, and Canada will not even be tax competitive anymore in that sector. And so I think that if the US ends up moving towards more deregulation, we'll hear from our next speaker about where they're going on that side, but if they're moving towards more deregulation, and if they're moving towards major tax reform, we're going to have a more important agenda to deal with innovation and the macroeconomic environment to encourage innovation in the future. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here today. So while Len started us off with policy, I'm actually going to punt on that, because my responsibility is not really around regulation and creating policy, but instead supporting the mission of the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, based on what the chairman has directed us to do. So instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do from an information technology perspective to be innovative in support of the mission of the FCC. So when I think about innovation, I think about two main words that come up: disruption and creativity. And so we are in a world now where we are continuously being disrupted, whether we like it or not, and we have to have what Dr. Bray has coined creative problem solvers so that we can address or be ready for those disruptors in innovation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey at the FCC and what we have done and accomplished as creative problem solvers and as change agents in support of the mission of the FCC. I came to the FCC about mid-2015 as the director, or as the acting, the DCIO of resiliency. And during that first half year of 2015, we focused on three main, I came on board and David had, Dr. David Bray had already a transformation plan. And really it's a transformation plan that had the two key qualities of innovation: the disruption and the creativity. And that transformation plan included a 3-year strategy about how we were going to bring the agency from its current legacy maintenance to a new era of cloud computing, automation, and digital transformation. And so we started in 2015 with the stabilization phase. The stabilization phase took place over a long weekend, although we took about 6 to 9 months to prepare, where we moved our main data center from our headquarters site onto to a commercial data center. And I will tell you, those were long hours, but it really cultivated a team effort that we are proud to say resulted in big success for the agency as a whole. In combination, in 2015, we also moved our email services to the cloud, and we contracted with Microsoft for O365 services. That allowed our users to be able to access their email anytime, anywhere. And that was a major breakthrough for the organization. And we've had a lot of positive feedback regarding that big move when it came to email. And then that takes us to, in 2016 and in 2017, we focused on the two other sets of phases. The first one is rationalization. Like many government agencies, we have a portfolio of applications, some of which do similar activities and in similar processes and have similar data. So we looked at our portfolio, the number of applications within our portfolio, and began to rationalize that portfolio. So the FCC obviously is main mission areas includes auctions and auctioning spectrum, and also licensing, right? And so once that auction happens, we're licensing. And so we looked at the plethora of the portfolio of applications, and were able to reduce the number of applications from about 250 down to 102 just through rationalization. And that's really taking the time with the business and IT partners together to sit down and say, what is the purpose of your business area and how can we incorporate it into a larger initiative. And then the third phase, which was started really as we did some rationalization, was really modernization. And so we have worked tirelessly with both the business and IT to really modernize and transform our applications and move them to the cloud. There's two main phases to doing that. Number one, it's business process reengineering. How can we do this better, easier, faster, and better, obviously, for our public and internal users. And then the second piece is obviously the IT modernization effort. And so Dr. Bray has talked extensively about our commitment early on when he got there to modernize our consumer help center, which allows the user base to provide complaints. And then just recently, this past year, we modernized our electronic commenting system, ECFS, and we have continued on that trail of modernization to include one of the big mission areas, or both mission areas really, the auction side and the licensing side. We have been on a journey of innovation and transformation that not only includes applications as a whole, but also, like many of you, we are ensuring resiliency, and we are focused on the security of our systems in the best interest of our consumers. So we have been on this journey now. I have been on this journey for about 2.5 years, and I'm excited for what the next couple of years are going to bring. One big thing, one big initiative that we just finished, and I'm sure this is something that all of you are aware of, is the incentive auction. So it's first ever kind auction, where it was designed to repurpose spectrum for new uses. So the auction preserved a robust broadcast TV industry while enabling stations to generate additional revenues that they can invest into programming and services to the communities that they serve. And by making valuable low-band airwaves available for wireless broadband, the incentive auction has benefited consumers by easing congestion on wireless networks, laying the groundwork for 5G services, and spurring job creation and economic growth. The auction just closed in March of 2017, with the resulting repurposing of 84 megahertz of spectrum, 70 megahertz for licensed due, and another 14 megahertz for wireless microphones and unlicensed use. The auction yielded a total of $19.8 billion in revenue, including $10 billion for winning broadcast bidders. There's much more ahead for the Commission as we ramp up with the new chairman. And so what we are focused on is a government that must continuously innovate to support the communications collaboration community between the consumers, government, and industry. And we're going to do that with our two descriptors for innovation, and that's continuous disruption and creativity. Thank you.
So I'm just going to make a few comments on intellectual property before I open it up for the question of the panel, then open it up to all of you. I thought what we heard was three of us are economists, but I think we are odd in that we are one-handed, one-armed economists. So intellectual property policy is something which Jim Basile, BlackBerry fame, has made a key project of his, and he says that we cannot confuse a science and technology strategy, which is invention, with a scale-up strategy, which is innovation. And it's how you generate intellectual property, how you protect it, how you commercialize it, how you scale it globally, how you transfer it, and requires a very different set of policies. So scale-up is now the buzzword, but it's not clear to me, and I was talking to Jack Mintz, what that means. Certainly, if you look at some of the strategies that the government is doing, such as the Vector Institute in artificial intelligence, it is a very good example of public-private support around a cohort of brilliant people, but it is replicable by others. Now, for the people in this room, it's really a continued evolution of what we used to call telephony. That's critical. So we talked about cusp at the beginning, and now 5G is on the cusp. As different as 4G is to 1G, which was analog, I think 5G is that different to 4G. It's a mix of licensed and unlicensed. It's a very different ecosystem. You need to engage with verticals such as autos and health. It's an unclear business model with huge capital costs. Current LTE network owners complain about lack of payback so far on that investment, and the orders of magnitude more for 5G. One wonders what the payback is on that. And we're seeing all kinds of alliances being built up once again, as they were in the 3G and 4G space. So we have the 5G PPP, the Global TD-LTE initiative. My favorite is the 5G AA. That is, maybe it's like Alcoholics Anonymous, and we decide maybe we just sit in a room and sing Kumbaya or something. In the background of all that is something I think that's really important, which is the current fighting that's going on standard essential patents and the FRAN royalties. And so when you look at the Apple and Samsung against Qualcomm and other both launches of antitrust action and commercial disputes, we're doing that at the same time as we're trying to incent new standards, new chipsets, and new software, and we're engaging in all these appropriality battles that could end up discouraging innovation. So to me, there's a big issue out there about how we have this brave new world of 5G and whether we can, how we're actually going to get there. So when the panel was talking, I wrote down 2 points, which is I think what we tend to forget in Canada. First is that innovation policy is not in a vacuum. While we're designing ours, everybody else is designing theirs. And so how do we make an innovation policy which is not set in stone for 10 years, but is something which I think I learned from Christine. The FCC is talking about innovation and disruption. I'm not sure the CRTC thinks that of themselves as being a disruptor or an innovator. And when the FCC is moving to Microsoft and to the cloud, well, Canada is investing more and more in very expensive legacy networks that do not function for government systems. One wonders where we're going to end up on that. So let me ask one question to the panel, and then I will open up to all of you. So are we too concerned with policy? I think is what Jack was talking about at the end there, isn't innovation really a firm role? Dan, we'll start with you.
Oh, okay. Of course, it is a firm role, and we have complained in the past, and that's why we have an innovation policy, that firms don't do enough to bring creative ideas to the marketplace in a way that benefits Canadians. So it's a firm role, but as I think Jack explained with respect to the tax regime, and as I think I mentioned with respect to innovation policy, government has a role to play. If we want businesses that are more innovative, we need to have the right environment for them to grow. And innovation, I think fundamentally, again, Jack mentioned the military in the US, requires some risk sharing so that the public benefits of innovation, because the benefits are not only private, but so that the benefits are in fact shared by the public. And so that's not going to be something that only the private sector is going to provide. I think from the point of view of, I think you need public incentives, public risk sharing, especially of course on basic science and technology, but also by way of grants, tax credits, and the right environment, as we discussed, tax-wise, regulatory-wise, that allows innovation to play its fundamental role in the growth of the economy, and also as disruptors. So you mentioned standards, you mentioned IP, and there are ways of conceiving standards and IP policy as being fairly open and conducive to growth, and there are other types of standards and IP policies that are really stifling growth to some extent, or policy regimes. So that's where I was talking about a fine balance. But I think ultimately it's a fine balance in government policy that lets business does its innovation thing, if you like.
Christine, do you want to add anything?
I'm not going to comment on the policy piece, but I will just say from an IT perspective, what we're doing is we're consistently and constantly challenging our vendors in industry to both in telecom and in private to be leaders in innovation, right? And to be those disruptors and those creative problem solvers to help us in government solve problems that we have. And so we are partnering with many folks, and we continue to, I'll say, push the button as fast as we can to continuously to innovate and move, be able to meet the requirements at the quicker pace that they're arriving to us now, even within government. So,
Jack.
Well, let me first of all start that I think Canada's had a relatively, for its size, a relatively dynamic telecommunications sector in general. It's not been as successful on the high-tech side as we've seen in the late 1990s. And I should say that I used to work with the World Bank and IMF and did corporate tax reforms around the world in many countries. And everybody had their incentives for high-tech and R&D, whether it was Jordan or South Africa or whatever. Everybody had it. But of course, none of it really worked, except the big successful ones were in the end, was the United States, as we've seen with the FANG, the 4 companies that have now, dominating now the world when it comes to what you might think of application of the internet. And a lot of that is driven by the firm, and in the end. And what gets in the way of firms are things like tax policies and regulations that can undermine, how well the market can function. But also in the United States has been a more competitive environment compared to Canada. We have a lot of protection of industry in Canada, not just in telecommunications, but you see it everywhere. Our power companies, they're mainly government owned, except for Alberta. We have lots of rules, supply management, other things, which inhibit the growth of many industries. And as a result, you're not going to have a very much demand for innovation in Canada if we continually protect many industries from competition. And this is my point that I was trying to say. The other role that I do think governments can play is in the area of procurement. And the Jenkins panel, I think, made this point very well. Canada, unlike the United States and Israel and other countries, when they do military procurement, for example, innovation is not even a criterion for the procurement process. And that's because we don't care. And a lot of innovation is driven by necessity. When governments do get involved, it's usually for their own necessity. Military is the best example of it, but it's for their own necessity of solving a problem. And that's when it's successful. And that's when governments get involved. I think that's the time when they should do it, is when they actually have a problem to solve. And then they go to the private sector if it's dynamic enough to help solve that problem. And that, to me, is when I think governments can play a very important role. And I see it right now in Ottawa, for example, the complete inability to develop new processes and procurement, in a really quick and logical manner. And some of you may have heard about the Phoenix system in Ottawa. It's an absolute disaster. God, I'm starting to sound like Donald Trump. But anyway, it's an absolute disaster.
Don't tweet. That's all we ask.
Sorry. It's an absolute disaster in terms of even getting payroll out. I know that some agencies, because they were lucky enough to have a somewhat separate system deal with their payroll, they were able to override the Phoenix system to make sure their employees got paid. And it takes years to get a project adopted. They're so slow. So I do think, and this is where I totally agree with Daniel, in terms of procurement and what governments do in terms of their own operations, there's very significant innovation opportunities there, and that could be a demand-driven process for innovation, and the private sector could be a very important part of supplying that.
Thanks, Jack. So questions from the audience. There are microphones around. Please come and step up, raise your hand. I can't see it very far, but let me ask another question. I talked a bit about standardization and these generational shifts that we've had, 3G, 4G, now maybe 5G. And these industry alliances that come about. So should these kinds of generational shifts and the standardization of technology, should that be left to industry, or is there a role there for governments to play? Jack, maybe you want to start.
Well, I go back, I remember the old Betamax and VHS. You know, could you imagine if governments ended up choosing which is the better tape recorder, you know, or, tape to have? Would have been a huge error. I mean, you know, in the end, because of competition between the two, one won out, the other one lost. And that's a good thing about competition. It really, you know, you get people that are providing a service to the public, and the ones that can provide the best service and the one that makes the most sense is going to end up winning out. And governments are not in that position to do that.
I'm sure Christine will.
I don't have anything to
I
add.
didn't think so. Dan.
Well, I tend to agree with Jack. I think we let the marketplace decide. I think, by the way, in a lot of industries, I don't know why I'm thinking of insurance, where you started what are today public standards, safety standards, and so on, were initially private standards developed by the industry. If you want insurance, you need to, this is what you need to do with your home, and so on and so forth. And now the public sector learned from that. And so I think, or public regulators. The only thing I would say, so we did a paper a couple of years ago on private regulation and saying, look, in a lot of areas, I think that was what Jack alluded to, really the private sector has just more information about what works, what's at the leading edge than the government can ever hope to have. And so we'll always have this battle of standards, and it's mostly going to be led by the private sector, I think. I think, on the other hand, a government needs to be on top of that because, of course, you do, in fact, want competition. You don't want one standard developed by one country to really dominate the others because your own standards are not necessarily allowed in that marketplace to compete in that marketplace, or products that have your own standards, if you see what I mean. So I think the government needs to stay on top of the fact that, in fact, at the limit, you know, private standards can also become an anti-competitive practice, and that's really what the government has to watch for in the end. But I think that's pretty much all they have to watch for.
I mean, we do need standards because, you know, if your phone's going to work or social media is going to work around the world, you have to have this ability to standardize. But if you look at, for example, the 3G battles, which were between the European standard versus the Qualcomm CDMA and GSM battles, governments did get very involved. Right? It was not just a marketplace of ideas, or that firms were just battling out for what was best, but the governments were really, you know, the Europeans especially, were really pushing for a European standard that would benefit Nokia and Ericsson to reap these worldwide rewards from markets such as India and China if they would move to that standard. So, but what is the role of a government like Canada in this new world of the fifth generation, 5G? How could we, as a smaller player, be at the table? Or how do we, or do we just wait for whatever happens is like manna or lightning that just happens to us? Do we get involved, and how do we get involved in these big worldwide battles for the next generation? That's a zinger. I'm just throwing it at you, Jack. So.
Okay, so since I seem to be picked on today, so I would argue that, and in fact, I think this is generally an issue for Canada. You know, we could try to, you know, in some areas, try to be a broker between different parts of the world. But frankly, we don't have that much power. We're only 35 million people. We're a small country, relatively. Not as big. In fact, even though we're part of the G7, we're not even the 7th largest economy anymore. We're well down the list. But I think all the time, for Canada, it's the region that we operate in, which is North America. And my feeling is that we have to keep an eye on the United States. And for us, I think the best thing to do is to make sure we have regulations that don't get in the way of trade between the United States and Canada, whether it's trade in services or trade in goods. And if a standard which works with the United States, that may be the most important one for us to incorporate in our policy making, because that will be critical for the future. So it'll be very interesting, because I know under the new NAFTA renegotiation that's being discussed, there are a couple of areas that have been identified by the U.S. representative letter of concerns vis-a-vis Canada in the digital area, as well as in intellectual property, particularly that grew out of the Supreme Court decision with respect to Lilly Pharmaceuticals, where a company is told that you can't apply for a patent until you spend all your money on clinical trials first, which has been a very serious issue for I think, patent making generally in North America, but one for us in Canada. And that's going to be an issue, I think, under the trade negotiations. So I think we'll have to watch for that. But I think there are some, I think we need to start changing our attitude and start looking to see what are the things that are best in our interests as a country, and if it means that we have to adopt certain standards that especially allow us to achieve that integration in North America, I think that will be best off for Canada.
1 minute, then I'm going to ask Christine a question.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well,
No,
you
no,
can go.
yeah, go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, just to reiterate, because Jack mentioned trade agreements, that trade agreements also have, and the new generation trade agreements, possibly the NAFTA modernization, is going to include something on competition, and we need to be aware, and I think that was the nature of your question, Len, that standards imposed by when they are imposed by governments or encouraged by governments to benefit their own industries, or of course IP litigation and so on. These things can be used in an anti-competitive practice, and I think that that's what Canada can do through standardization bodies, trade agreements, and other means, but they have to be multinational means. We can't do this on our own, or regional means, to ensure that these anti-competitive effects, when they do emerge, or practices are limited.
Christine, let me throw you a zinger. You can decline, but you're our one CIO on the panel among 3 economists, you know. So just how do you see artificial intelligence affecting the telecom sector? How will it, for the people in the room, how do they think forward and think of, is AI, the Vector Institute that's going on in Canada now, is that something I have to ignore, or do I really have to pay attention to it?
So Linda, to answer your question, I think we need to pay attention to it. I mean, it's coming, and it's fast and furious, and it's going to be a disruptor definitely from within IT. And so later on this afternoon, around 2 o'clock, when I do a keynote presentation with Dr. David Bray, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think there are multitude of innovators and multitude of folks who are actually continuously, I'm going to say again, disrupting what IT is going to look like. And there are definitely places where we believe we need to be more resilient, and we need to talk more about security, about privacy, and those are concerns that are coming up with artificial intelligence. And so more to come. Thank you.
Well, on your behalf, I'd like to thank this panel.
And Len, let me echo my thanks on that. Len, Dan, Christine, Jack, thank you very much for sharing your perspectives at the Canadian Telecom Summit. Thank you. And as Christine said, foreshadowing a second appearance that she'll have later this afternoon with Dr. David Bray. So we have, we've got our share of doctors here, and not one of you can help me with my back problems. So. But thank you for being here.
See you, specialist.